All right, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on when you're watching this. This is going to be Chapter 6 of the Cryptological Aspects of ESP. It's a document that you can find on the CIA Crest Library. I'm just going to get right into it. Testing for the cryptological aspects of ESP. The purpose of the ESP experiments herein described is threefold. To determine what effect human extra-perceptive capabilities, temporarily categorized as telepathy and clairvoyance, could have on the COMSEC posture of the United States. The prime target areas being considered are code and cipher keying materials and encrypted text, underlying plain text of encrypted messages, and knowledge of message originators or processors. I think this, just having a little bit more familiarity than some of the average people watching this, that means sort of like envelope reading or card reading, where you can actually read the slip of paper that may be, hidden in a binder behind a door, a lock and key, as well as telepathically intercepting that knowledge from an actual individual who is responsible, a person who is associated with that code or cipher or knows the code or cipher. And then in other cases, they go in with random generators where if no parties are aware of it and it's remained unseen by someone, is it possible to find those codes as well? Next paragraph here. To determine what factors enhance the phenomenon known as telepathy and clairvoyance and what factors detract from its operation. Factors thought by researchers to contribute to performance success are listed in Appendix-A. This includes in preliminary tests, and fully controlled tests are indicated by asterisks. It is hoped that knowledge of such factors will provide useful defensive security knowledge should a COMSEC threat be realized in this area, to find talented subjects so that A and B above can be determined. So experimental material. It was decided at an early stage in the project the combinations of code groups and their meanings would be used as target material for the tests. The reasons for their choices were: it made the test related to the agency mission. By using combinations, it would be possible to obtain 100 guesses out of only 50 transmissions. It was considered that the resulting abbreviation of each testing session would inhibit the decline factor, which has so often detracted from the results of previous parapsychological tests. Subjects could be convinced that the test involved a real agency problem, which immediately increased interest and attention. The material permitted flexibility. Symbols or meanings having idiosyncratic significance for the subject could be isolated, which permitted some tailoring of the test to personality of the subject. So let's just look back at, we considered the resulting abbreviation of each testing session would inhibit the decline factor. So the decline factor is known in parapsychological tests as how someone will do well initially, and then all of a sudden they fall off, and everything goes downhill. And the last paragraph, the material permitted flexibility. I've referenced, I think it was in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, where they discovered that tailoring a situation to someone's abilities before they were tested, I guess in a sense, making them comfortable both, spatially, physically, mentally, increased their ability, as well as the original supposition that anybody who believes in it initially without any primer or promoting of the idea, somebody who just actually fully believes in ESP or telepathy, always seems to perform better than anybody who doesn't. Which again sort of makes sense, but they're not, this process isn't about what makes sense to us emotionally. It's making a repeatable and provable and demonstratable set of objectives that can be qualified and quantified to prove that this does work. So even down here at the footnote of the asterisk, note the decline factor is a constant decline in positive test results in written tests or knowledge or ability in human beings. The principal cause apparent to be boredom, individual significance for that participant person. A few typos. So boredom. I would speculate that what has also happened is that agents that were able or talented themselves could have been interfering with the test. And I also think that as we see in later documents through the experimentation using EEG and ELF and VHF, it's quite possible that instrumentation was either deliberately employed to hinder someone or was just accidentally doing it. And I'm sure obviously they went through those tests as well. Code group meaning provided a constant context, a fixed environment, condition, or relationship. It was not difficult to adapt the material to statistical procedures already established in prior psychological and parapsychological research. Preliminary tests. The purpose of the preliminary test was to test the text and thereby to ascertain if it were a useful tool. Those who acted as participants, receivers in parentheses, in the preliminary tests were young college graduates, about 40% of them male and about 60% female. The groups tested were from virtually every state in the Union. Asterisk, double asterisk. The attitude toward the test was typically one of considerable interest, combined with an ambivalent hope-fear attitude of individuals toward exhibiting the phenomena themselves. I mean, that's how young people are. It's usually ambivalent, and they're not sure, and they're unconfident, and they need to be primed a little bit. Randomness. The order of the 50 transmissions was put into a random matrix, such as that in Appendix B1. The random pattern itself was chosen by one tester from available agency-produced crypto material. Since only 5 possible combinations of code groups and meanings were used, and each future combination was automatically designated A, B, C, D, or E, these letters, rather than the actual combinations themselves, were randomized. The randomized matrix was kept in a safe prior to the test to preclude access by anyone except the tester and the transmitter themselves. So here they're actually saying someone who did see it could transmit it either accidentally or purposefully to someone else just by seeing it. The combinations were randomized at the last minute as a further safeguard. Conditioning the participants, or conditioning. The percipients were given an ESP pep talk before the test to heighten their enthusiasm, and an attempt was made to have the students verbalize their thoughts on the subject in order to enhance the conditions of normal communications in the hope that channels of unusual communications would thereby also be enhanced. Students were encouraged to choose code group meanings which had significance to them, although in one session the transmitter was permitted to establish the timing of the transmissions. This was found to make the test too lengthy. It was finally decided that transmitting at a steady 10-second interval was most comfortable for all concerned. So I don't think this needs to be expounded upon, but they had to prime everybody, get them enthused, keep them from becoming bored, and not make the duration of it exceed either their boredom or their enthusiasm. Physical conditions and controls. During the best controlled preliminary test, the percipients were located in a room about 40 feet away from the transmitter, who was in an outside hallway in the alcove, see Appendix-C. There was a monitor posted with the percipient and the transmitter. Timing was passed by word of mouth from a monitor who was stationed with the transmitter. The idea of a monitor is twofold in that it means there's a camera watching them, and later on, as they developed this process, a monitor would have been, or could have been also, someone who was monitoring the person as they were in the field mentally, or the transmitter, or someone who was monitoring the entire group somehow. I think I mentioned the hub-spoke method or the federated method, where in one way it's passed from point to point, which is federated, and then but it continues in a unified method so that all parties are eventually receiving it. So it's federated, or the hub and spoke method, which is one person who controls whatever it is and then pushes it out to individuals as needed. Experimental controls. In order to separate those who might have a more active ESP capability from those who might not, a simple test was designed with no stringent controls. The statistics are the same as those of the Rhine cards, that's the Rhine Institute, but in this instance, 5 love-hate symbols, cross, swastika, heart, U.S. flag, and peace dove were substituted for the usual symbols. It was additionally decided that anyone who achieved 12 or more correct guesses or 9 or less correct guesses would be included in the experimental group. So one way to debunk this would have been said, I think in the previous paragraphs, we saw that what they did is they purposefully chose things that people were familiar with. And then in this case, the test here again was using symbols that people were already familiar with. Obviously, if this is true and this works, which I do believe it is, and I think the research and the money spent also proves it, but a contention or a point against it would be that is it easier to receive and transmit things that everyone is familiar with versus the more abstract symbols or something that's been freshly created. And the remote viewing aspect of this, where people were able to view distant sites or rooms thousands of miles away, I think would prove what I've just said is actually possible, since if someone's not familiar with anything in the room, or they're seeing a piece of machinery or a piece of technology, they're going to have trouble describing it, but nonetheless they were able to receive and transmit abstract concepts or items or objects fairly well. And it also seems that a type of memory and recall are also part of the skill set, whereby you're able to maintain the transmission, also verbally talk about it at the same time in some contexts, and what becomes a very high level skill is to draw what you're seeing as well. And then with the cameras also, I think for me, I've also personally, from my own experiences, anytime there was a camera in the room, it doesn't matter. I mean, it could be 40 feet up, or if I walked into a public mall or a private room or whatever it was, I just always knew there was someone watching me, and it happened so many times to me that I thought I was being programmed, in a way where I was like, why can I walk into this area and immediately look up without any previous knowledge, look up and see this camera in this area, or walk over to this area and see that there's sort of a hidden, obscured camera in a bush or in a plant. And it now, in retrospect, with all this knowledge developed by the CIA and NSA, excuse me, it's clear that either I was somehow able to recognize that someone else was watching me, or I was possibly just picking up on the electrical field or whatever, in one way or another. And as I've possibly mentioned in Chapter 1 or Chapter 2, it's been proven that younger people make better subjects and better talents and potentials because they're not weighed down with all of the stuff that we are as adults growing up. It doesn't mean that we don't have the ability. Everyone does, but the raw intercept method or raw interpretation method or the raw transmission method is less likely to be hindered and met with skepticism, as it happens, like I said I did, at a younger age, because you have no familiarity with it, so you're not likely to disregard it as quickly. And that's something that a lot of us all do, whether it be a social setting or anything where, most people's consider their conversational skills or intelligence to be predicated on how quickly they can disregard something, not how quickly they can embrace it. Let me take a drink here, excuse me. It was additionally decided that anyone who achieved 12 or more correct guesses or 9 or less correct guesses would be included in the experimental group. It is interesting to note that 2 symbols which were received best, even by subjects who only guess 5 or 6 correctly, were the cross, 22% correct, or the flag, 20% correct, followed by the swastika, 18% correct. Results in this test, so to get over my jumblation there, it's basically, I guess you could say the cross, the swastika, and the American flag would be more popular than the heart or the peace dove symbol, thereby making it easier and more receptive, as I just tried to explain, for young people and mid-level adults. mid-aged adults, that's possible that the strength in the recognition of the symbol increases or decreases the power of the transmission. I could postulate that. Results in this test. Each combination of code group and code meaning was counted as 2 guesses. The mean chance expectance, MCE in parentheses, for 100 guesses where the possibilities are 1 in 5 is 20 correct. Although it developed that the actual mean for 35 subjects and 3,500 guesses was less than 18%. The expected standard deviation is plus or 4 minus. All of this indicates that those subjects who scored more than 24 correct guesses show a deviation in favor of ESP. Correct combinations were also studied statistically. Eventually, I'll stop stumbling over my words. I apologize to the listeners. The same laws apply. However, the expectancy in this case is for the MCE to be 2 correct with an SD of 1 in either direction. So it's basically 70-30. The 12 members of the experimental group showed a total positive deviation of 26 hits above the expected SD, or 60 for 12 people. So they actually had an 80 to 90 while using a lower expectation. The 10 members of the control group showed a total positive deviation of 5 hits above the expected SD of 50 for 10 people. The control group also showed double the total negative deviation of the positive group below SD. So they doubled their negative for those who they thought would not get it right. So it was actually higher negative than what they predicted, and they doubled their positive, as it turned out to be double their positive prediction. Meaning that the researchers were right by 200% on those who were going to get it right, and wrong by 200% on those who were going to get it. I mean, they were also right by 200% on those they predicted to get wrong. Within the experimental group, there were 4 individuals who scored double or more the number of correct hits expected. One of these individuals was omitted, that's a blocked out piece of text, who scored 29 correct guesses on the code groups or meanings, more than 2 times the standard deviation. This subject also scored an unusually high number of hits on guessing combinations, 6 instead of the expected 2. Within the control group, no extraordinary positive deviations occurred except where one subject guesses 5 combinations correctly. However, 5 fairly significant negative deviations from MSC were scored, 2 of -7 and 3 of -5. So this could be a result of the swing pattern, as the undulation of the waveform that creates the statistic if we were to plot this out, where the declination becomes more apparent, where the boredom starts to set in, or the monotony starts to create boredom. I guess you would have to really know more about each subject that was used and have a little bit more thorough understanding of their situation and environment as this test was being given from a psychological standpoint. Preliminary test conclusions. Since the controls of the experiment were not considered stringent enough to eliminate all possibilities of unusual sensory perception, it must be concluded that the testing method was only possible an acceptable vehicle for isolating the ESP phenomena. So they're just saying at least they've proven it's possible. They're not trying to box themselves into an absolute position yet. It was decided that further tests would have to be made of high-scoring subjects from the preliminary phase to ensure intended purpose. It appears that some subjects who in the first preliminary test were told that they did no better than the average tended to suppress their ESP capability, which had the result of producing a significant negative deviation in the second preliminary test. Let's read that over again. It appears that some subjects who in the first preliminary tests were told that they did no better than average tended to suppress their ESP capability, which had the result of producing they basically said you're going to do bad, or you were doing bad, so you got worse as you went along. Fully controlled conditions. With some expectations, the approach, attitudes, and preparatory steps used with the fully controlled ESP tests were the same as those used on preliminary. Okay, so the principal deviations from the original conditions were in the nature of. So here they actually establish what some of the deviations were caused by. A more complete indoctrination of the recipient in the aims of the tests and the conditions thought to enhance test performance. So it's a primer again. The indoctrination stressed, among other things, the probable agency used for ESP capability, as well as the fact that the development of ESP was part of an overall personality enrichment effort. So they might have said, hey, this is going to make you better, you're going to feel better after you engage in it. There were 3 series of tests conducted, each consisting of 50 transmissions of 50 code group meaning combinations. Each test lasted approximately 30 minutes. That's a long time if you're not familiar with any of this and someone's spent another considerable amount of time priming you and setting you up and trying to get a grip on your mind and where you're at psychologically. I've actually been involved in a similar fielding experiment, and it's quite likely that it's also very similar to the interview process that a lot of us go through as we're getting jobs and stuff, especially in the corporate world where we know that intel agents work, covertly. Although the random matrix for scrambling the basic code group meaning combinations were still made up days ahead of time, the random sequences of the combinations themselves were made up at the last minute by a monitor, not normally associated with the tests, who flipped a coin to decide which random sequence to use. So there's a nice little qualification of what I said, where if the people who were, if I was the one creating the drawing, I might inadvertently pass that knowledge on mentally, or I could be compromised mentally. However, with newer knowledge that really basically, especially coming from the DIA and the Army, as well as DARPA and MIT and all these other people, any action a person goes through, right, whatever they're doing is going to make their brain active, and that activity transmits itself as a theta wave. So unless it's a randomized generator, or unless it's another, like say, artificial intelligence that's creating all this stuff that doesn't transmit or emit theta waves, I guess plausibly you would say it doesn't matter. At some point, the right psychic or telepathic or ESP or the right talent would still be able in some way or another to figure out, would be able to receive the transmission if it's always being performed by a human in some capacity. So even if I flip the coin, I may not be able to get the code, but I may have guessed at how the coin landed, because I was able to sort of receive a little bit of that transmission, that theta wave that those people emitted. The test transmitter was isolated from the receiver by a distance of approximately 1.5 miles. So now, with what I just said, they're using distance to say, let's say, to see what signal strength would be, right? How strong that theta wave could transmit, which we know could happen over thousands of miles based on previous research or existing research and additional research. But here they're actually going to test exactly what I just said. The receiver was placed under the scrutiny of agency psychologist Dr. That's blocked out. I don't know why that would be blocked out, since they revealed so many other names. Excuse me. Timing was provided by using synchronized electric clocks activated by a single short phone call from the tester who stayed with the transmitter under monitoring. The 10-second interval was maintained by the monitor at each end, verbalizing each numbered interval. The tests were marked by Dr. That's blocked out, or another monitor at the receiver site. 5 or 10 warm-up questions were used at the insistence of the receiver. Okay, so a primer, again, another form of primer, to get them in their frame of mind. It is a meditation, even though we call it a warm-up. It is a variation of a meditation. In test 2, the receiver was known to be having a personal disagreement with the transmitter. Excuse me. Let me get another drink here. So that's interesting. In test 2, the receiver was known to be having a personal disagreement with the transmitter, but the test was allowed to continue in order to observe the effect this might have. In test, what what if people were sleeping together, right? Or they had a relationship off the books and they had been effectively keeping that from the group? That might very well translate into the HR or human resources rules of no relationships on site or on premises. In test 3, another transmitter was added to the first transmitting in hopes that this might offset any negative attitudes that might have carried over from the conditions existing under test 2. Note that this transmitter was retained because Miss, name blocked out, had such good rapport with her during the preliminary tests. The receiver's room was subjected to jackhammer-like noises. The transmitter site was also subject to temporary disruptive noises, door knocking. Test 3 was conducted under extremely diverse conditions. Actually, let's go back to that. So living in New York, this is a constant method of distraction, especially with all the helicopters, which aren't around today because we're experiencing the same 40-foot high mist in 40-degree weather that we seem to experience in 80-degree weather. And that's obviously geoengineering, but I'll get into that later, and these things all tie together, and I will be able to show that later. If you haven't already just catapulted ahead of this document in my readings and done your own research. But what this paragraph also sheds light on is that the relationship between the group, where we talked about in that notes on concerns of ESP from the NSA, that document, they had figured out already that the bond between the people, the receivers, the monitors, the transmitters, let's just say, also the people in the field, the investigator, the person undercover, the spy, so to speak, the camera, the moving spy eye, who is transmitting what they see to their receiver or monitor. The bond between them was important and critical. And again, referencing chapter 1, where I may have expounded on the notions of brainstorming and good group think among or within corporate environments for people who have to tackle challenges related to the brand or come up with inventions and ideas. It's well known that the relationship, without even using ESP or telepathy to support that, the relationship between the group is crucial to how productive they are, how well they perform, and all that stuff. So it really is just like, be nice and get along with people, be open-minded, be objective, and if you find yourself resenting someone or something in those situations, you yourself have to figure out how to become balanced again among that group. However, with that also is the fact that there are people capable of making you unsettled and uncomfortable through telepathy. So, and that attack vector, for what I'm calling it right now, is also documented as well in these. So we have agents and potentials who some embrace it and have a great relationship with one another, and then we have others who were chaos agents. They basically went in there to disrupt everything. Whether it's a test, if someone went in there to be the proverbial jackhammer in the group to see how well they work together, or someone was just literally in there to sabotage what was going on. Test 3 was conducted under extremely adverse conditions. The receiver was under constant scrutiny by guest observers. To me, that has always unsettled me. I've always performed better just sort of in the wild, so to speak, and if I found out I was doing something that was eventually going to harm people, or I didn't believe in it, for example, working on pharmaceuticals in the marketing and advertising world, I actually had found out that basically what I was about to work on was a lot of hyperbole. There was no real need for what we were trying to promote and sell, and in effect, instead of becoming someone who was communicating an idea or product for a much needed useful requirement, I was just trying to earn extra money for the company. And that really just, it's like I immediately disconnected from everybody. My walls went up, and I was just thinking of ways to get out of it. And I think I honestly even said, I don't think I'm qualified to work on this. I think because I was starting to feel guilty about the potential contract and the size of the money and how many people were in the room who were also employed under the same company as myself, many of which who have children, and families, I tried to steer it a little bit into something else, to try to reframe it even in my own mind as something positive. And eventually I came around to finding a comfortable place. But the point of that is to say that, if you don't believe in it, even if you believe in ESP and telepathy, the minute your moral and ethical standing and positions come into play as well, your ability is gonna break down and decline too. Excuse me. And I think that that's also a psyop too. I think that that's used as a weapon to test people too. Under fully controlled conditions, Miss, name blocked out, still continued to score significantly, but lower than under the preliminary tests. With the same number of total guesses involved as in the preliminary tests, Mrs. name blocked out made 77 correct guesses for individual code groups and meanings, or about 2.4 times the expected rate. That's high. Even if 2.4 seems low, it's still high when you look at that it was only 77 correct guesses. The subject also guessed 10 combinations instead of the expected 6, or twice the expected rate. It should be noted that Mrs. Blank scored highest in both categories on the last test, the most difficult in terms of conditions. On this occasion, she, it says we, was asked if she thought she had gotten any one combination correct more often than the other. She correctly replied, SCO attack, which constituted 4 of the 6 correct combinations which she guessed on the third test. In 2 preliminary tests, Mrs. Blank had duplicated this feat. In both instances, the code meaning had been the word retreat. In the first such instance, Miss Blank guessed 6 combinations correctly, 5 of which contained the meaning retreat. The total combinations involved were the usual 50. Under similar conditions, Mrs. Blank again guessed 5 combinations correctly, 4 of which contained the meaning retreat. Okay, so that's an interesting way to approach the test. And again, highly intelligent. We obviously recognize how smart our researchers and test givers are, at least simply in accepting that they could be wrong and trying to figure out ways how to prove they're wrong and right. And that's obviously a huge skill set in itself with regards to any scientific endeavor. Smart people all around, right? It should be noted that on the occasion of her final test, Mrs. Blank was asked if anything disturbed her during the test. The transmitters had estimated that around question 24 there had been a disturbing series of knocks on the door of the room. This question was checked off on the answer sheet. Miss Blank replied that around question 20 she felt like giving up. An intriguing coincidence. The exact same thoughts were going through the transmitter's mind at the same time. So that's like an inception. That's basically you're incepting someone's mind. You're bringing negativity to the group inadvertently, and while also just trying to struggle to stay connected and be positive and engage with the group for the greater benefit of the group. But it just shows how really mentally stable we have to be. And I don't mean not being crazy, because I'm just saying when I say mentally stable, I mean able to control your emotions internally as well as your output. And on that note, let's just talk about some other interesting things not related to the mind, but that do affect the mind. There are also groups of people who are talented, let's say potentials, who have the ability to observe on a physical level someone's discontent, right? Where they can notice a twitch or an itch or shuffle or a creasing of the hands or a creasing of the ear. Or, they notice the biological effects on people, which in turn give them insight as well. Like looking at your dog and knowing when it's happy or sad, as well as like I guess the law enforcement being able to tell when someone's lying, both by their body heat, maybe a lie detector, but also maybe the less refined and less scientific investigator who has a great instinct for just being able to tell by visual cues that the body makes itself unintentionally, right? So you're unintentionally communicating your emotions without any telepathy as well. I would bet that a lot of these people in those groups, in this case, these people were separated by 2 miles, 1.5 miles actually. In other cases, though, where we put the groups together, if people are actually making eye contact with one another and looking at each other, which is kind of a common, social requisite, I'm sure that was inflicting people as well. So next paragraph. Since Miss Blank scored more significantly under conditions which were more competitive and encouraged greater intra-group communication, these conditions should probably be given more emphasis in future tests. On 3 tests, 2 preliminary and 1 fully controlled, Mrs. Blank seemed to display an affinity for a particular code meaning. If such an affinity should prove to have any durability, it should be of measurable benefit to cryptoanalysis. Since Mrs. Blank scored more significantly when there were 2 transmitters, the possibility of enhancing percipient performance by using groups of transmitters should be given greater emphasis. In this connection, it might also be beneficial to score groups of receivers in a collective manner, i.e., if 3 out of 5 people guess combination A, it is considered the group answer. That's fair. That's fair enough. It is considered that other test methods involving more realistic situations might measurably enhance test results. It appears that personality clashes between transmitter and receiver tend to cause a lack of interest on the part of the persons concerned, which may result in a near-average performance by even talented subjects. That makes sense. I mean, those of us that live and work on the street recognize that without ESP or telepathy. Miss Blank's ability to produce near-random guesses of target material appeared to be considerably above average. The above test results indicate that human ESP capability provides a better-than-chance expectancy result on random cryptographic material. So they're basically saying, yes, we can be compromised. For this reason, the human ESP capability could be a significant threat to U.S. COMSEC in all of the categories indicated in paragraph 1A. In view of the result, the National Security Agency, the NSA, cannot afford to remain ignorant of the scientific advances in utilizing or developing this field. A recommendation. It is strongly recommended that the agency seek to acquire all available information on the subject of ESP research. It is recommended that the agency's psychological testing program be amended to include a test such as that reported above, which would serve 2 purposes: to isolate super guessers, or persons who have a knack for cryptoanalysis, to isolate persons who have a high ESP potential. So super guessers, in today's lexicon, if I were to make a analogy, would be sort of having a cryptographic key or a code or a password, and then you have a program or a piece of software that just goes in and does password cracking, where it doesn't have ESP. What it does is just takes all the possible character variations and at an accelerated rate cycles through them until they either reveal your randomized character password, or if you've used a common word phrase or common word password like Senate is cool, ESP is cool, it'll eventually just find that by sequencing through all 26 letters in the alphabet, including punctuation and stuff, as fast as possible. That's all that means. It's a super guesser. And then the second one, to isolate persons who have a high ESP potential, that's someone who has ESP. Another recommendation. It is recommended that future ESP tests concentrate on the collective testing and scoring of groups or of receivers and transmitters. It is recommended that some real material be included for ESP targeting in future tests. I don't know the context of what real material means, other than, if you took a National Geographic magazine that was already printed or maybe in circulation for a year or two, would somebody be able to guess the picture that you were looking at? That might be it. So we're here at Appendix-A, and these are factors considered to benefit the operation of ESP tests. This is a pretty cool little list here. Creating a realistic situation. Number 2, getting transmitter and receiver to concentrate on sending and receiving with each person considering the other as an intended target. Conditioning the subjects to react to the material properly to consider the test important. Testing subjects who have demonstrated ESP capability by some degree. Give feeling of success to sender and receiver by praising positive and negative deviations. Transmitting of targets in some sort of context or natural environment. Limiting each test session to a short period. Building on success by eliminating unsuccessful materials or conditions and conserving successful ones. Trying to open as many channels of normal human communications as possible, and opening them wide. Synchronization of sender and receiver, using groups of transmitters, testing groups of receivers in some collective way, so as to discover even slight trends in responses which defy chance. There's a lot to absorb there, and you could make a lot of. I've experienced a lot of this stuff on my own through the corporate world, and also being a contractor within the agency environment. And in retrospect, now I see that that's exactly what they were doing. They were fielding all of us for intuitive gifts, especially in the creative world or creative realm of advertising and marketing. Whether you're a good creative director or a bad creative director or a good art director or a bad art director, and what I mean by that is, a dark arts user or a good arts, white arts user. These are all utilized now. These are all subtly included and incorporated into interviews and HR processes, and most definitely turned into online games and tests and things like that, as well as probably incorporated into gaming theory, which is then incorporated into all the games and the online games that people play. I'm sure this has all been weaponized, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but maybe utilized and weaponized are not necessarily synonymous, but they're tied together in what they seek to find as the end result. Appendix-B. This is just a random matrix. You can read through this on your own. Just pause it and go through it. These are the, apparently the test has made A, B, C, D, and E, identified what they were. So B was an attack, C was a target, A was something killed, D was women and children, and E was intelligence. And then they randomized, maybe they used that word specifically, or they used an image of that and then transmitted that image. And then they block out the participants. And then there's a layout of how the experiment was conducted, and there's a drawing, an overhead drawing of where everyone was seated. And we're looking at like 4 recipients, the sender, a guard, a guard, a guard. I mean, is it possible the guards were interfering with transmissions too, right? That's possible. I'm sure they've done that study as well. All right, so that brings a close to Chapter 6, and let's just go right on to Chapter 7. I'll cut this video off now. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.